I've always believed that most things in life happen when they're supposed to, even if the timing makes no sense to us. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the day I found a letter in my mailbox that had been written half a century ago. Before I get into it, let me ask you something. Have you ever received or found something from the past that made you stop and rethink everything? A letter, a photograph, a name you'd never heard before, a small object that suddenly shifted how you understood your life. If you have, I'd really love to hear about it in the comments. And if you feel like sharing, tell me where you're listening from, what state, what town. Somehow it makes stories like this feel less lonely. This began on a Thursday morning in late October. The kind of morning where the air is cool enough to feel like fall, but the sun still has that lingering warmth. I was standing on my porch with a cup of coffee in my hand, not even tasting it yet, just enjoying the quiet. In your 50s, quiet mornings start to feel like a luxury. When you're young, mornings are a sprint. Later on, they become something you notice. The mail that day was exactly what I expected. Bills, flyers, a charity request, the usual noise of modern life. And then, sitting right on top, there was an envelope that didn't look like it belonged to this century. I knew it immediately, without thinking too hard about it. The paper was yellowed and softened at the corners, worn in a way that felt honest, not staged or vintage, but truly aged. The stamp showed a price that hadn't existed for decades. The ink on the address was faded into that iron-gray color old handwriting turns after years of light and time. Across the front, in careful cursive, it said, Margaret Torres. My first name was Margaret. The last name wasn't mine. The return address read, Oak Ridge, PA, a town I barely recognized, the kind of place you drive through without meaning to stop, the kind of place with more history than traffic. I turned the envelope over in my hands, and that's when I saw the postmark. 1973. 50 years ago. I stood there on my porch, with the sun on my face and the envelope in my hand, and my brain couldn't quite settle on what it meant. I was born in 1972. That meant the letter had been mailed when I was barely more than a baby. How does something travel for 50 years? How does it not get destroyed, tossed, lost forever? For a moment, I wondered if it was a strange advertisement or a novelty, something designed to look old. But it felt too real. The paper was too fragile. The wear was too natural. There was a seriousness to it, like it had been carried for a long time and survived anyway. I brought it inside and sat down at my kitchen table. I remember how still the house felt in that moment. My coffee sat untouched. The daylight shifted slightly through the window. The world kept moving, but I didn't. I opened the envelope slowly, trying not to tear it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded neatly in thirds, as if it had been folded that way for most of its life. The handwriting was the same careful cursive as the envelope, steady, practiced, personal. My eyes found the first line and I felt my breath catch. Dear Margaret, if this letter ever finds its way to you, please know that I never stopped thinking about you. It was signed at the bottom, Daniel Harper. The name meant nothing to me, not even faintly, but the emotion in the letter was unmistakable. Reading it felt intimate in a way I didn't expect, like holding someone else's private history in my hands. I kept reading. Daniel wrote about meeting a girl named Margaret at a county fair in the summer of 1968. He described the kind of connection that can happen in a small, ordinary moment and then stay lodged in a person's life. He wrote about sitting together near a barn as the day turned golden, talking for only a couple of hours, sharing dreams and family stories and plans that felt real, because youth makes everything feel possible. He wrote about how he meant to find her again. He planned to return, to look for her, to pick up where they left off. In his mind, that reunion was already part of the story. But then life stepped in. There were draft notices. There was a family emergency that pulled him across the country fast. He tried writing to her, tried finding her, but the address didn't work the way he thought it would. Years passed. He moved. He joined the military. He built a life that went on without her because life always goes on. But the letter kept returning to the same truth. He never forgot her. The handwriting shifted as I read further, just slightly, as if the person writing had grown older during the act of putting words on paper. Daniel wrote about going through his mother's things during a difficult season of his life and finding something that stopped him cold. An old letter he'd written years earlier, never mailed, sealed in an envelope with Margaret's name on it, tucked away like a time capsule. Finding that letter felt like finding proof of a younger version of himself. Proof that he once loved with the kind of intensity that only younger hearts seem to manage. And when he found it, decades later, it stirred up everything that had been buried under routine and responsibility. So he decided to try again. He looked up the original address. He wrote. He mailed the letter in 1973, without knowing if she still lived there, without knowing if she was alive, without knowing if the message would ever reach anyone. He wrote that some things are important enough to attempt, even when the odds are terrible. Near the end, his words softened into something that made my eyes sting. He said he hoped her life had been full and good. He said their moment had been small, but real. He said he wanted to leave proof in the world that she mattered. Proof that evening mattered. Because even if they never got their second chapter, the first one had stayed with him. When I reached the signature again, just Daniel, I stared at the page for a long time. The letter was beautiful in a quiet way, and it was also heartbreaking, because it carried the weight of something unfinished. It felt like a message in a bottle that had somehow washed up on the shore decades late. And then the obvious fact hit me, sharp and cold. The Margaret he wrote to wasn't me. I wasn't even alive in 1968. I couldn't have been the girl from the fair. I sat there trying to understand how this letter could have ended up in my hands anyway. Then I looked at the envelope again. The address was my address. The house I'd lived in for the past 15 years. And that's when I remembered the woman who sold me this house. Her name had been Margaret Torres. She was an older woman, probably in her 80s when we closed. I remembered her tired kindness, the way she seemed ready to move on. The realtor had mentioned she didn't have local family and was moving to Florida to be closer to her sister. We met only twice, once at the inspection, once at the closing, and then she was gone from my life. A few years after I moved in, I received notice that she had passed away. The Margaret this letter belonged to had lived here. The letter had finally arrived at the correct address. Only after she was gone, I sat there in my kitchen, holding someone else's love story in my hands, and felt a strange sense of responsibility settle over me. Not because I thought I could fix anything, but because it felt wrong for this message to arrive after 50 years and then be treated like junk mail. So I decided to learn who Margaret Torres had been. And that decision is what turned a mysterious envelope into a story that changed the way I look at time, at love, and at the small moments we think don't matter. The next day I started with the easiest facts, property records, old listings, anything that could give me a timeline. I learned quickly that Margaret Torres had lived in this house for decades, long enough that the address had become part of her identity. It made sense that the letter, wandering through systems and time, would keep trying to return here. I went to the local library and searched archived newspapers, I found an obituary. She had been a teacher, 3rd grade, at the local elementary school for more than 30 years. The obituary listed her volunteer work, her church involvement, her devotion to her students and community. It also said she never married. None of it surprised me, and all of it did. I remembered how she looked at closing, small, careful, polite, like someone who had learned to keep her private life truly private. Now I understood that there might have been reasons for that. People who carry something tender for a long time often learn how to live around it. I drove to what was left of Oak Ridge, Pennsylvania. It wasn't far, but it felt like stepping into a quieter century. A historical society office sat in a small building that looked like it had survived, mostly because people refused to let it disappear. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and wood polish and the kind of dust that feels permanent. A volunteer welcomed me with the warm curiosity of someone delighted to have a visitor who actually wanted to know things. I explained what I was doing. I didn't hand over the letter itself at first. I didn't want to treat it like a museum piece, but I described it. I said the name Margaret Torres. I said County Fair, 1968. I said Daniel Harper. The volunteer pointed me toward old yearbooks and directories. I spent hours flipping pages and scanning lines of tiny print. Eventually, I found her, Margaret Torres in a yearbook photo, smiling with a room of children, her hair styled in a way that marked the decades in one glance. She looked gentle and steady, the kind of teacher people remember. But the real shift came when an older woman entered the Historical Society office later that afternoon. She was in her late 80s, maybe older, moving carefully, like someone who had learned to be patient with her own body. She was cataloging photographs at a desk, sliding them into protective sleeves. When she heard Margaret Torres's name, her expression changed. Not dramatically, just a kind of quiet recognition. She remembered Margaret. They went to school together. She described Margaret as quiet, kind, the sort of girl people trusted. And then she mentioned something that made the letter in my purse feel heavier. She remembered a summer when Margaret had briefly seemed lighter, almost glowing, and then afterward, something shifted. Margaret was still kind, still dependable, but there was a sadness that never quite left her. The older woman said it felt like part of Margaret was always waiting for something that never arrived. She didn't know details. Margaret rarely spoke about her private life, but she remembered one moment, one comment Margaret made after the fair, something about meeting someone and thinking she could have loved him if life had been different. And then the older woman remembered something else, a small wooden box. Margaret kept it on her dresser, she said. She called it her happy memory. She was protective of it, careful with it, like it held something too precious to risk. The older woman had only seen it opened once, and inside there had been a photograph, maybe a few small items, and then the lid closed again. I drove home with that phrase repeating in my mind, happy memory. For the first time since I bought my house, I walked through it thinking about the life that came before mine. I imagined Margaret living here alone, teaching children, volunteering, keeping her routines, and still carrying a moment from her youth like a private lantern. I searched gently at first. Old closets, attic corners, the kinds of places people tuck away keepsakes. I didn't expect to find anything. I thought maybe the box had been moved with her to Florida. Maybe it had been thrown out by a relative. Maybe it was long gone. And then I noticed it. In the master bedroom closet, the back wall had one board that looked slightly different. Not obvious, just enough to make my eyes pause. It sat unevenly, as if it had been removed and replaced. I pulled on it. It slid free more easily than it should have. Behind it was a small hidden space, just big enough to hold something important. And inside, exactly as if it had been waiting, was a wooden box. It was small and dark, polished smooth by years of handling. The kind of smoothness you only get from hands returning to the same object again and again. I held it for a long moment before opening it, the way you hold something when you already know it matters. Inside, wrapped in faded blue fabric, was a small set of items arranged carefully. A county fair ticket stub dated August 1968. A pressed flower, thin and delicate, nearly translucent with age, and a black and white photograph. The photograph showed a young woman sitting on barn steps. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was smiling at someone just outside the frame, and the joy in that smile was almost painful to see. It didn't look like a posed picture. It looked like a real moment caught mid-breath. On the back, in handwriting that matched the letter, were a few words and an initial, proof that Daniel's hand had touched this photograph too. I sat down right there on the closet floor and cried. I cried for the obvious reason, because it was sad. 2 people, 1 evening, a lifetime of wondering, but I also cried because it was strangely beautiful, because what they had was real enough that it lasted. It didn't need decades of marriage to matter. It mattered because it happened, because it changed them, because it stayed. I read Daniel's letter again that night, with the photograph beside me. It didn't feel like an orphaned message anymore. It felt like a conversation that finally had both voices in the room, his words on paper, her happy memory hidden in wood and cloth. I'll never know if Margaret received Daniel's letter before she died. The timing is a mystery that may never resolve. But I do know this. She kept the proof of that night her whole life. She didn't treat it as a childish fling. She treated it as something sacred. I placed everything back in the box carefully and kept it safe, together with the letter. Not because it belonged to me, but because it felt wrong to let it scatter again after it finally resurfaced. And something changed in me after that. I stopped dismissing small moments as unimportant. I stopped assuming only long relationships deserved to count. Because I had held evidence in my hands that a couple of hours on a summer evening can echo for 50 years. A few days later, I did something simple. I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, not because I needed anything, not because it was convenient, just because the letter reminded me that time moves whether we act or not, and that silence becomes permanent faster than we expect. That call felt awkward at first, the way long gaps do, but by the end we were laughing like we hadn't lost years at all. That's what this story gave me in the end. It didn't give Margaret and Daniel a second chapter. I can't pretend it did, but it gave me a reminder that the words we don't say become weight. That love doesn't always get a tidy ending, but it can still be real, still meaningful, still worth honoring. If you've ever found something from the past that made you see the present differently, I'd love to hear about it. And if you haven't, you can still tell me where you're listening from, what state, what town, what kind of day you're having. Because sometimes the most important messages are the ones that arrive late, and if we're lucky, they arrive in time to change at least one living heart.